Ever wondered how America quietly took control of the century without anyone noticing? Let's rewind history and find out. The film opens on a quiet shoreline. The ocean is pale, the air still. Smoke from a war that has ended drifts like a memory across distant skies, thinning with the wind. The world breathes out at last. In ruined cities, an old century closes its door. Across the water, one nation stands with its fields unburned and its factories intact. Assembly lines that once served a storm now keep moving in a calmer rhythm. The workers step from night shifts into morning light, carrying lunch pails and the habit of speed. Warehouses are full. Trains cross mountains with steel and wheat. In neighborhoods, radios return to music, and kitchens hum with electric promises. A new kind of dawn is forming, not in the blaze of conquest, but in the steady glow of production. On maps, borders look the same, but the deeper outlines have changed. Power is shifting from flags to flows. Energy, credit, signals, standards. The great empires of land have collapsed, but another structure, less visible and more patient, begins to rise. It will move along shipping lanes and banking halls, through classrooms and cinemas, across runways and undersea cables. It will ask less for obedience than for participation. It will not march, it will organize. From the silence after gunfire, a method appears. The method belongs to a country that learned to build quickly and in abundance, and now wonders what to build next. The answer lies not in territory, but in systems that others will choose because they work. The century will not be seized by force. It will be arranged by design. The question, as the smoke clears, is simple and large. How does a nation make the world move to its quiet rhythm? Before the Second War set the pattern, the First War cracked the shell. When the United States entered the conflict in 1917, it did so late and with an engine already running. Shipyards stretched their timetables. Farms shifted to feed armies and cities at once. Banks learned to manage risk across oceans. Factories tested their limits and found they could do more. The nation discovered the leverage of scale. When the armistice came, America stepped back across the Atlantic, but the lesson remained. The country's strength did not depend on holding colonies. It depended on making more than anyone else and moving it faster. The war debt web tied European treasuries to American lenders. The dollar began to travel not as a souvenir, but as a standard. With the 1920s came a lightness that felt like release. Assembly lines produced not only trucks and turbines, but watches, refrigerators, and radios. Advertising found a language for ordinary dreams and sold it in clean type. Jazz crossed borders without a passport. Cities rose with steel frames and glass faces, and along their streets, storefront windows taught people to want. Ideas about time, leisure, and personal comfort were packaged and shipped like any other product. Culture was not a parade, it was a supply chain. This was new power, still underestimated, moving without drums. Yet under the noise of prosperity, a question formed, soft but steady. What happens when the rhythm of desire outruns the balance of money? The answer arrived as a long descent. The stock market fell, and with it, the floating confidence of the 20s. What had been easy and fast turned fragile. Banks failed and took savings with them. Factories slowed, their belts hanging like tired muscles. The country turned inward, not from choice, but from necessity. It faced lines for bread and a landscape of foreclosed farms. Out of this heaviness came experiments. The state entered the economy not as conqueror, but as mechanic. It tested tools, public works, social insurance, regulation of finance, each one a small bridge over a larger gap. The market did not disappear. It was coaxed into new habits. Electricity extended to places the private grid had skipped. Labor rules tried to balance bargaining power. Monetary policy learned to breathe with the nation, expanding and contracting with care. None of this was perfect, and none of it was simple. But the decade of struggle taught planners and entrepreneurs to share a table. It taught accountants to think about employment as well as profit. It taught voters to evaluate programs as systems, not events. A blueprint took shape in reports and routines, ready to be scaled if conditions ever demanded it. When war returned to Europe and Asia, the United States carried not just industry, but a tested grammar for guiding it. The old question of control shifted again. Could stability be engineered? And if so, could it be exported? World War II pushed every lever to the limit. The nation converted in weeks what would once have taken years. Car plants stamped aircraft parts. Canneries ran day and night. Scientific labs turned into command posts for physics and code. Shipyards stitched metal hulls like tailors, while railroads pulsed with coal and troops. The country became an engine room with the lights always on. Production statistics, once dull columns, became a kind of poetry of motion. Tanks per month, tons per day, circuits per hour. At home, ration books trained a large society to coordinate. Abroad, convoys formed a steel spine across the ocean. When the war finally ended, the United States held not only victory, but a workforce skilled in cooperation, a management class fluent in logistics, and a treasury able to finance scale. Other great powers had lost factories to bombs. America had gained them to muscle memory. The battlefield faded, but the infrastructure remained. It could now be redirected like a river rechanneled after a flood. The post-war question was immediate and structural. If the world needed to rebuild, and America had the tools and credit to help, could a system be built that made recovery depend on shared rules? The answer revealed itself in a cluster of institutions and agreements that would frame the next half-century. At Bretton Woods, delegates from many nations met in a cool hotel and agreed on a plan that tied currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold. It was a quiet anchor placed under the waves. The International Monetary Fund would guard stability. The World Bank would finance development. Trade agreements would reduce barriers step by step. The United Nations assembled to offer a forum,
imperfect but enduring, where disputes might be spoken before they turned into fire. These were not empires, they were platforms. They fixed exchange rates, moderated shocks, and set expectations. The Marshall Plan followed as a practical extension of the same logic. Lend capital, ship equipment, transfer know-how, and demand simple, transparent accounting. Europe's factories restarted with American machines and standards. Procurement forms taught a method as much as they financed projects. In the Pacific, another arc of alliances and assistance took shape. Supply chains stitched themselves to American ports and, with time, to American corporations that knew how to manage them at scale. The center of gravity moved from conquest to coordination. In this new field, the strongest power was the one most trusted to keep the rules in place. It raised a new kind of question. What does it mean to lead when leadership looks like maintenance? The dollar, secured by gold and reputation, became the world's punctuation mark. Contracts were written in it. Oil was priced in it. Reserves were held in it. Central banks learned to watch the Federal Reserve as closely as their own councils. When ships unloaded in distant harbors, invoices settled in the American unit. This was not tribute. It was convenience becoming habit. The habit produced influence. Interest rates set in Washington echoed through construction sites in Lima, textile mills in Taipei, and wheat fields in Ankara. The currency did what armies could not. It standardized expectation. Multinational companies amplified the effect. They carried management routines, quality control, and marketing templates into dozens of countries. A refrigerator in São Paulo shared parts with one in Des Moines. A film in Cairo carried the same studio logo as one in Chicago. The network expanded through profit, but its byproduct was a social rhythm. Work week lengths, holiday seasons, consumer cycles that converged across continents. Yet such alignment also exposed seams. Local industries asked for breathing room. Politicians spoke of sovereignty in the language of tariffs and quotas. The system answered with negotiation, revision, and sometimes pressure. It was a soft architecture, but not weightless. Quietly, a hinge formed. Could a world of many histories accept one monetary timekeeper without resentment building underneath? The Cold War settled like a long winter, but most of it unfolded far from front lines. It was a contest of production, ideas, and futures. The United States did not seek colonies. It sought partners who would adopt compatible systems. Military bases appeared without the old language of possession, connected by defense treaties and supply agreements. The promise was security. The price was alignment. Radio broadcasts carried music and news that framed freedom as choice and dignity as variety. Universities welcomed students from new nations and trained them in disciplines that traveled: engineering, economics, medicine, law. When these students returned home, they brought not allegiance, but procedures: how to run a central bank, how to audit a firm, how to design a highway code. Films and television added a steady layer of images in which daily life followed certain patterns: the open road, the suburban morning, the office elevator, the supermarket aisle. It was not propaganda in the old, loud sense. It was influenced by repetition. Meanwhile, the space program sent a message in clean lines and precise sequences. The future was a project, and projects needed resources that only large, organized systems could deliver. A new thought took root around the globe, sometimes admired, sometimes feared. Perhaps modernity itself had an accent.
At home, the contrast grew sharper. The country that spoke of liberty abroad confronted the segregation written into its streets, schools, and voting booths. Television carried images of protests and police, marches and countermarches, court rulings and slow compliance. The Constitution, often cited overseas, was tested in local courthouses. The civil rights era did not dismantle the system. It forced it to match its rhetoric. Laws changed, and with them, habits. The process was halting, uneven, and incomplete, but it altered the country's moral vocabulary. The Vietnam War added a different kind of strain. The limits of military power became visible in jungles and on evening news broadcasts. Strategy met public opinion and faltered. Yet even as the war undermined faith in intervention, the economic network that linked America to the world kept growing. Container ships standardized trade. Computers entered offices. The dollar left gold in 1971 and floated on trust and capacity, not metal. Oil shocks reordered budgets, but the habit of using the dollar remained. The system absorbed shocks as a forest absorbs wind. Branches bent, leaves fell, trunks held. From these contradictions, a quieter and more durable lesson emerged. External influence could be large, while internal consensus was fragile. The question sharpened: how long can a structure rest on both confidence and doubt? The late 20th century became an age of integration. Supply chains stretched across borders and then across oceans. Trade agreements lowered barriers in steps, creating corridors for parts and data. Deregulation in certain sectors increased competition at home while expanding reach abroad. Silicon chips shrank and multiplied, making calculation cheap and communication quick. The United States excelled at producing platforms others could join. Operating systems, financial instruments, research networks, satellite constellations. The culture industry refined a global shorthand of humor, style, and pacing that traveled without translation. English, already widespread through commerce and academia, became the default interface for digital life. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a large counter-system dissolved. The victory felt subdued, almost administrative. New states entered global markets and sought stabilization loans. Economists who had studied in American universities advised on privatization and regulation. Philanthropies seeded civil society groups. Investment banks and consulting firms offered templates for corporate governance. The aim was not uniformity, but compatibility. By the mid-1990s, globalization felt like weather. Everywhere, invisible, routine. Critics called it dependency. Advocates called it efficiency. Many called it simply modern. The American role was not announced with parades. It appeared in default settings. The open question was whether the defaults could adapt as more users logged on. The new century arrived with quiet shocks and louder ones. Markets knit together by confidence revealed their fragility when finance mispriced risk at scale. The crisis that began in 2007 and deepened in 2008 spread through the same channels that had once carried prosperity. The response, coordinated among central banks and treasuries, showed both the reach and the burden of leadership. Liquidity lines crossed borders. Stimulus packages tried to replace demand that had vanished. The dollar, despite being at the origin of the storm, became the shelter in the rain. Meanwhile, the web matured into a fabric of daily life. American platforms hosted conversations, transactions, and archives of human routine. Smartphones made the network pocket-sized. Cultural exports turned into interactions, not just films and songs, but feeds and code libraries, development tools, and open courses. The military footprint adjusted to a world of drones, cyber operations, and partnerships. The political climate within the United States grew more divided, but the system it had built abroad kept running. Many nations criticized certain policies while relying on the pipelines of trade, finance, and information that the United States still serviced. The world had learned the rhythm, even when it questioned the conductor. And so the story returns to a gentle, persistent question as the camera drifts over a sleepless city in a century shaped by soft power and shared systems. What does it mean to inherit the morning after the world has already learned your song? Demobilization did not mean stopping. It meant redirecting. Soldiers returned to classrooms with tuition paid by a new social contract. The GI Bill moved through towns like spring water, filling colleges, trade schools, and home mortgages. Builders laid out neighborhoods in repeating lines, simple houses with yards and garages, connected by roads that were still 2 lanes wide. Inside, appliances turned labor into switches. At dinner tables, families measured time by television programming. The screen brought stadiums, news desks, and variety shows into quiet rooms, giving the nation a shared clock. Retail chains learned to follow the new suburbs, and logistics learned to meet them halfway. Tastes settled into patterns that could be forecast quarter by quarter. In offices, managers studied flowcharts. On assembly lines, efficiency became routine. The interstate highway system arrived first as a plan, then as concrete. It linked military logistics with civilian convenience, threading together regions that had once felt distant. Gas stations became waypoints. Distribution centers rose near cloverleafs. A country scaled itself to the size of the automobile. With each exit sign, markets thickened, and with each overpass, the distance between factory and living room shortened. The economy discovered that mobility itself was a resource. Yet every new mile carried a hidden arithmetic. If roads rewired the map, what would they do to the balance between local identity and national rhythm? Security found a new shape in alliances. NATO formed with a promise that an attack on one would bring the attention of all. It was a sentence written in policy but enforced by planning. Standardized calibers, interoperable radios, shared drills, common maps. The Berlin airlift tested the idea that access could be defended without a shot. Day after day, planes rose from runways in the west and landed in a city ringed by uncertainty, carrying flour, coal, and confidence. It was a lesson in persistence and logistics, and it set a tone. Supplies could signal resolve as clearly as troops. Alongside the alliance, aid programs extended the reach of recovery. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation coordinated projects with spreadsheets and patience. In embassies and ministries, the new language of policy, targets, inputs, outputs took hold. The American presence grew quieter in form, but wider in consequence. It appeared as training manuals, procurement rules, and warehouse inventories. The air bridge ended with runways intact and a message embedded. Access could be maintained by movement alone. From this success settled a broader question that would shadow the age. If air could become a road, what other limits could logistics dissolve? Korea arrived as a cold front breaking into rain. The war that followed was bounded, brutal, and instructive. The United States fought not to annex, but to draw a line, and the line held at heavy cost. Defense budgets rose and then settled at a new plateau. Contractors learned to deliver on schedules that no longer ended with peace. Research labs fused university curiosity with military urgency. Jet engines matured, radar sharpened, transistors left the laboratory and began their patient march into devices. A phrase entered speeches about a permanent linkage between industry and defense. And behind the phrase, a structure formed: contracts, standards, clearances, audits. The nation accepted a standing state of readiness, and with it, a steady stream of innovation that spilled into civilian life. Aviation safety, weather forecasting, materials science. The lesson was ambiguous but durable. Preparation could be productive. Yet the cost of a mobilized peace was not only fiscal, it was conceptual. When normal included alertness, how could restraint be measured, and by whom? In 1956, a canal far away became a mirror. When Britain, France, and Israel moved against Egypt over Suez, the United States chose pressure over partnership. Financial tools did the work that fleets once would have attempted. Markets watched the dollar watched the White House. Credit lines narrowed and sterling bent. The message was delicate but unmistakable. In a world organized by liquidity and confidence, leverage belonged to whoever could steady or unsteady the flow. The IMF mediated, negotiations untied knots, troops withdrew. The episode marked a quiet transfer. The old empires were learning they no longer set the terms of crisis. America did not plant a flag on the canal, it adjusted the incentives around it. The event became a case study in how influence could operate without occupation. It advised future policymakers that reputations could be moved by interest rates as easily as by battleships. The canal kept its banks, the system kept its precedent. From that season came a lasting thought. If credit could compel, what other ambitions might be guided by the same invisible reins? The map changed through decolonization. New flags rose over capitals, from Accra to Jakarta. Their leaders faced the same first problems: currency stability, agricultural yields, roads to ports, schools for the next generation. American universities opened doors to students who would return as ministers, engineers, and central bankers. Economics development offered models with curves and multipliers. The Peace Corps sent volunteers with notebooks and practical optimism. Grants financed clinics and seed laboratories. Loans built dams and bridges. Conferences like Bandung proposed a third path, neither Western nor Soviet, and many nations tried to keep their footing between offers. The United States learned the craft of conditionality, tying funds to transparency, to procurement rules, to market reforms. Sometimes the advice fit, sometimes it chafed. Yet the pattern held. Expertise became a currency, and institutions traveled with it. A shared vocabulary of policy took root in places with very different histories. The result was uneven but real, a network of practices that made cooperation possible even when ideology did not align. A soft puzzle sat beneath the progress. Could partnership avoid becoming patronage as needs deepened and choices narrowed? The sky became a stage for patience. Rockets carried satellites that mapped clouds and relayed signals. Capsules carried crews that showed the world a calm procedure for entering and leaving orbit. The moon landing in 1969 served as a monument to process, checklists, redundancies, margins of error. It was seen by millions on television, and for many, it fixed an association between American capability and the future itself. Beneath the spectacle, other systems matured. Semiconductor factories learned the discipline of clean rooms. Supply chains stretched to feed them with ultra-pure inputs. Research agencies funded networks among universities, linking time-sharing computers into an early web where packets moved by rules rather than rank. ARPANET hummed to life in the same year footsteps pressed lunar dust. The lesson threaded through labs and offices. Coordination at scale could yield breakthroughs that no single institution could manage alone. The country's civil and military realms shared tools more than slogans. A question settled into the hum of servers and the role of assembly lines. If networks could flatten distance, what would they do to authority?
In 1971, convertibility ended. The dollar decoupled from gold and learned to float on confidence, productivity, and policy. Exchange rates moved, textbooks were revised, central banks adjusted their rituals. 2 years later, oil producers used price as leverage and reminded importers that energy was a strategic vein. Lines formed at gas stations. Thermostats moved a few degrees downward. The economy absorbed an unfamiliar kind of shock. Yet the system adapted. Oil contracts stayed in dollars, and the revenue returned to global markets through banks in New York and London. Petrodollar recycling financed deficits and development alike. Futures markets grew, and with them a hedger's logic that treated uncertainty as a tradable input. The dollar's role, questioned at first, was reinforced by use. The world learned to treat volatility as a problem to be managed rather than a crisis to be escaped. It was a sober education in interdependence. A quiet riddle lingered in boardrooms and policy retreats. If value now rested on trust and throughput, what would anchor trust when cycles turned? At decade's end, interest rates rose like a wall. The Volcker shock aimed to crush inflation, and did. The cost was a recession at home and a wave of debt crises abroad. In Latin America, obligations denominated in dollars became heavier as rates climbed. Restructuring plans, negotiation teams, and IMF programs filled hotel conference rooms. The result was austerity for many and a slower recovery than anyone liked, but also a clearer sense of discipline for central banks. In the United States, deregulation loosened some sectors, while new rules stabilized others. Tax policy changed, unions lost power, finance gained speed. Japan's ascent provided a mirror. Quality, efficiency, and export prowess built on patient capital. Plaza Accord managers adjusted exchange rates to cool imbalances, nudging currencies like careful pilots correcting drift. The semiconductor race accelerated with new fabrication nodes. A template for cooperation among treasuries emerged, informal but real. The system revealed resilience, though not without scars. The open problem remained steady and practical. Could coordination tame momentum without slipping into paralysis?
The wall in Berlin opened and the Soviet Union unraveled. The end arrived without the battle many had expected. In the vacuum, a set of norms spread quickly. Privatize state industries, liberalize trade, stabilize money, invite investment. Capital flowed in, then sometimes fled, teaching hard lessons about timing and transparency. The Gulf War showed a different skill: coalition building under the banner of international law, logistics as choreography, and technology as reassurance. Television carried images of precise strikes and returning convoys, emphasizing procedure more than triumph. The World Trade Organization formed in 1995, writing rules with sections and annexes that would guide disputes in conference rooms rather than on battlefields. For a moment, it seemed that a broad consensus on economic order had been reached. But consensus can be thin. As the last rival superpower receded, a softer question expanded. What fills the space where opposition once provided definition? The 1990s turned code into a commons. Browsers opened the web to routine use. The Netscape moment suggested that infrastructure could be funded by expectation as much as revenue. The Telecommunications Act loosened old bindings and encouraged new entrants. Startups gathered in warehouses and wrote software that turned servers into markets. Venture capital learned to price possibilities in rounds. NAFTA tightened North American production lines, spreading parts across borders and returning finished goods along the same roads. Fiber optic cables were laid with a confidence that future traffic would justify present cost. The decade taught the world new gestures: email as letter, search as library, link as citation, update as habit. Stock tickers became a kind of public scoreboard for optimism. When the bubble burst, the scaffolding remained: data centers, protocols, trained minds. The American ecosystem of risk and reinvestment showed its cycle once again: build, correct, absorb, continue. Amid the rise and fall, a steadier pattern surfaced like a watermark. The map was being redrawn by networks, and networks obeyed standards. The next question approached with a quiet inevitability: if the code became the map, who would write the legend?
The century's first shock arrived from a clear sky. Towers fell, walls of policy shifted, and a new vocabulary of security settled into daily life. Airports learned to be stern. Intelligence agencies rewired their channels. The United States entered distant deserts and mountains with coalitions and mandates that grew complicated in practice. Budgets redirected to surveillance and special operations. Technologies built for search and advertising found new uses in watch lists and pattern analysis. The home front adjusted to color-coded alerts and a steady murmur of vigilance. Yet even as troops rotated and strategies changed, the wider network held its rhythm. The dollar remained the invoice of oil. Financial markets closed and reopened, wounded but functioning. Media carried grief, then debate, then routine again. In the background, the infrastructure of the web thickened. Fiber was buried, satellites launched, data centers cooled their aisles with disciplined air. A paradox sharpened. In response to fear, the country built even more connective tissue. Commerce and communication accelerated inside a fortified shell. The question gently rose from this tension between openness and defense. Could a nation expand its influence while guarding every door?
Wars stretched into long commitments. The operational map became a mosaic of raids, training missions, and aid projects. The idea of victory blurred into management. Contractors delivered logistics at scale. Drones extended reach without headlines. Veterans returned with skills and burdens that reshaped communities and clinics. Energy markets reacted to risk, then settled into pricing dominated by expectation more than interruption. At home, the Department of Homeland Security coordinated agencies that had once lived apart. Emergency plans became templates for floods, storms, and pandemics as much as attacks. The military learned to share bandwidth with development projects, while diplomats carried binders of metrics to measure stability, like rainfall. In this period, another force matured across the Pacific. China accelerated through manufacturing tiers, built ports and railways, and assembled reserves in dollars. Container ships left its coast heavy and returned with recyclables and software rights. American retailers measured seasons by shipments from factories they did not own. The two economies folded into each other like gears with different teeth counts. Dependence was mutual but asymmetrical.
A quiet line appeared under quarterly reports and policy briefs. If your largest customer is also your largest competitor, which clock do you follow?
The smartphone placed the network in the hand. A rectangle of glass collapsed the distance between markets, media, and friends. American platforms became the addresses of everyday life. Their interfaces set norms for speech, attention, and exchange. App stores turned code into shelf space. Cloud services made computation elastic. Startups rented capacity the way factories once rented railcars. Advertisers learned to follow a person rather than a program. The result was a steady stream of micro-decisions shaped by algorithms written in campuses along the Pacific coast. Language adapted to taps and swipes. News became a scroll. Entertainment learned to autoplay. Exports were no longer just films and machines, but frameworks, APIs, design systems, ad exchanges. A country once known for assembly lines now exported habits of mind and patterns of time. Regulatory questions multiplied: privacy, competition, speech, labor classification. Other governments watched and wrote their own rules, sometimes accepting defaults, sometimes building walls of code. The soft empire of standards reached its widest span and met its first strong countercurrents. The lingering inquiry grew sharper. If influence lives inside the interface, who is accountable for the shape of the day?
Then finance stumbled. Mortgage risk had been sliced thin and sold wide, and when assumptions failed, the tremor became global. Banks hesitated, credit froze, trade slowed as letters of credit became scarce. The United States led a response of emergency lending, guarantees, capital injections, and coordinated rate cuts. Legislators argued and then acted. The Federal Reserve extended lines to foreign central banks, turning the dollar into a shared fire hose. The move was technical and decisive. It showed that the world had one lender of last resort because it had one currency deep enough to serve as ballast. The recovery was uneven, but the pipes unfroze. Outrage remained, and reforms arrived in stacks of pages, but the underlying reliance did not change. Markets learned new acronyms. Banks learned to hold more capital. Regulators learned to watch shadows as well as walls. The lesson was both comforting and unsettling. The system could be saved by the same center it accused of causing the storm. A quiet doubt began to follow the charts. How many times can the same anchor hold?
Energy shifted in the ground. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling turned old basins into new frontiers. The United States moved from heavy importer to near self-sufficiency in oil and gas. Petrochemical plants expanded. Exports of liquefied natural gas drew new lines on maps. Foreign policy adjusted by degrees, less tied to Middle Eastern flows than it had been for decades. Prices responded to a new swing producer that operated not by decree, but by the collective decisions of thousands of firms and lenders. This flexibility was economic leverage of a different kind, a market-based cushion against external pressure. Yet the shift carried environmental costs and debates that stirred towns and legislatures. The world's climate concern pressed toward treaties and carbon markets. Technology firms promised efficiency. Car makers planned fleets of batteries. The United States found itself both an energy power and a climate negotiator. Weighing growth against transition, the balance looked manageable on spreadsheets and unstable in politics. The next question assembled in policy memos and investor calls. Could an economy built on abundance learn to lead in restraint?
Trade architecture entered an era of redesign. Agreements stretched beyond tariffs to include rules on data flows, labor, and the environment. Supply chains became case studies in resilience, not just cost. Factories rebalanced just in time with just in case. Ports invested in cranes and software. Customs deployed scanners and risk algorithms. Meanwhile, China's Belt and Road Initiative offered infrastructure and financing that linked continents with steel and debt. Competing visions of connectivity emerged. One routed through private capital and standards bodies led by the United States and its allies, another routed through state-backed banks and contractors directed from Beijing. Many countries joined both, hedging bets. Arbitration panels replaced gunboats. Project finance replaced protectorates. The contest moved from borders to bids and from slogans to spreadsheets. Even as competition sharpened, the channels for trade stayed open because everyone needed them. The delicate thought behind every summit communique became plain. Can rival systems share the same arteries without clotting?
Domestic politics grew louder while institutions worked in quiet. Polarization turned hearings into theater and headlines into loops. Yet airports functioned. The mail arrived. Patents were examined. Satellites launched. Vaccines approved. Farms insured. And payments cleared each night through an electronic system most citizens never saw. The resilience of the administrative state became a second layer of stability beneath partisan weather. Courts decided disputes that would have been crises in other eras. States experimented with policies that sometimes spread nationwide. The economy shifted toward services, then toward software, then toward data. Inequality widened in some places and narrowed in others, a map of divergence that fed frustration. Millennials formed households later. Cities drew talent and pushed out cost. Small towns searched for new anchors. The question was not collapse, but cohesion. Could a vast network knit by finance and culture still renew the civic ties that gave it legitimacy?
A pandemic tested every wire. Supply chains snapped in unexpected places. Glove factories, reagent plants, and shipping containers in the wrong harbors. Offices emptied into bedrooms. Video calls replaced travel. Central banks again opened dollar lines. Congress passed relief at historic scale. Scientists raced from code to trial to approval. The United States faltered and then adapted in ways both impressive and incomplete. Its research universities and pharmaceutical companies delivered vaccines at speed. Its public health system struggled with coordination and trust. The rest of the world watched, sometimes following, sometimes departing. Platforms became essential utilities for work, school, and social life, exposing their power and fragility. Inflation later returned, testing the art of tightening without breaking. The period compressed years of change into months. A practical question emerged from the quiet toll. Could the same networks that spread shocks faster also spread resilience wider? Strategic thinking returned to basics. Semiconductors became national assets. Rare earths and battery supply chains received new attention. Export controls turned from niche tools to central policy instruments. Alliances updated their charters for cyber defense and space debris. In Europe, war reappeared and redrew energy maps in a winter of recalculation. The United States coordinated sanctions with partners, freezing assets and transactions rather than crossing borders. Finance acted as frontier. The dollar's role proved both powerful and controversial, reminding capitals that integration carried political terms. Meanwhile, culture continued its quieter work. Streaming services served series in many languages, but measured success in the same dashboard. Gaming communities spanned continents. Universities rebuilt exchanges of scholars after travel resumed. The signal in the noise was continuity. The American-shaped operating system of the world still booted each morning, even as modules were rewritten. The next problem sat with an engineer's patience. How much rewiring can a plane endure while still in flight?
Amid all this, the narrative arc came into focus. The United States had not taken the century by owning maps, but by standardizing processes. Accounting rules, container sizes, database schemas, safety codes, movie runtimes, keyboard layouts. Its power was not the sound of command, but the convenience of compatibility. The costs were real, dependencies that pinched, debates that divided, fatigue that dulled attention. Yet the structure held because it delivered something most societies value: predictability with room for choice. As new powers matured, they adopted parts, adapted others, and built alternatives where they could. The world became a multiplex of systems with overlapping membership. In that multiplex, America remained the projection booth more often than the star on screen. The closing hum of servers and substations offered a modest verdict: influence lasts when it is useful. The open ending, as the camera moves to a quiet intersection where traffic lights cycle on a timer invented a lifetime ago, is still unresolved. When usefulness meets ambition, which one decides the next century's rhythm? The camera settles over a grid of ports at dusk. Cranes move with the deliberation of metronomes. Containers stack into colored walls that echo a quiet doctrine. Make things interchangeable, and movement becomes thoughtless. In this logic, a small gasket made in one valley will fit a pump assembled by strangers a continent away. The United States did not invent the desire for order, but it perfected a way to turn order into habit. Standards bodies met in carpeted rooms and wrote dimensions that outlived their authors. Shipping pallets became the footprint of global commerce. Barcodes reduced identity to lines and intervals. The credit card turned trust into a rectangle that slid the same way in Lima as in Louisville. Behind these banal objects, an architecture of liability and insurance blossomed, linking courts, auditors, and warehouses into a single rhythm of reassurance. Even music followed the pattern, compressed into formats that could be streamed anywhere without skipping. What looked like convenience was a philosophy with screws and sockets. It carried a promise that the world might run on time if every piece learned its size. The promise in universities became the republic's soft engine. Campuses drew students with syllabi that traveled better than passports, granting credentials that functioned as keys in many cities at once. Grants pulled curiosity into consortia, labs sharing results with timestamps and preprints, conferences looping year to year like seasons. Ideas moved from chalkboards to prototypes to venture pitches without changing buildings. Foreign scholars arrived, taught, researched, then either stayed to build or left with notebooks full of methods. The system did not demand allegiance, it demanded peer review. What it exported most reliably was technique. How to run a randomized trial, how to build a data set, how to model uncertainty. The result was a quiet homology across institutions from Boston to Bengaluru, from Berkeley to Berlin. When a problem appeared, crop yields under heat stress, a new pathogen, a faster cryptographic proof, the community responded with a common grammar. The United States benefited doubly, as host and as a hub. Yet hosting carried strain. Housing grew costly near campuses. Adjuncts multiplied. Politics entered seminar rooms through the same networks that once insulated them. The lecture hall dimmed and left a soft query hanging like dust in projector light. Can openness still anchor excellence when openness itself is contested?
Culture remained the friendly courier of systems. A pair of sneakers became a global vernacular. Sitcoms taught the cadence of banter that needed no subtitles. Sports leagues scheduled games to fit prime times half a world apart, and streaming stitched together fan communities that had never seen the same skyline. Museums toured collections, chefs translated comfort across menus, and tourism arranged memory into itineraries with refund policies. The American approach to leisure, weekend rituals, seasonal sales, traffic to beaches and mountains, settled into other calendars. Not all of it stayed American. Borrowed forms returned revised, and the circulation strengthened both the center and the periphery. Meanwhile, advertising recalibrated from spectacle to persuasion at scale, testing messages the way labs test compounds. The result was a subtle consolidation. Taste converged enough to support mega projects, while niches thrived inside the larger canopy, all priced in a currency that most banks recognized without hesitation. Here lay the softest edge of influence, not an instruction, but an option that felt natural. Softness, however, carries weight when aggregated. The evening closes on a question that reads like a footnote and feels like a thesis. At what point does preference become structure?
Law traveled more slowly than screens, but it traveled. Corporate forms, arbitration clauses, merger doctrines, and antitrust thresholds migrated through casebooks and seminars into ministries that needed templates. The promise was predictability. A firm would know the rules of liability, a lender the route to recovery, a startup the boundaries of imitation. The United States served as reference, both admired and amended. Courts in other capitals cited decisions from its benches. Regulators adapted its thresholds to local markets. Behind the migration stood a dense insurance ecology. Reinsurers, measuring risk with models that drank decades of American data. Rating agencies assigning letters that could lower the price of borrowing with a keystroke. When disputes crossed borders, neutral forums convened. When treaties met friction, side letters smoothed edges. Over time, this legal web reduced friction so effectively that capital began to outrun politics, finding projects long before parliaments found consensus. Stability arrived, then pressure with it. As investments matured, expectations hardened, and reforms moved from advice to condition. The lens pulls back from stacks of filings to the skyline they shape and leaves a temperate doubt. How many promises can a system honor before promises own the system?
The map of the American military scattered like constellations, small clusters of personnel, logistics nodes, radar arrays, and runways maintained with meticulous care. Bases were less about conquest than about timing, refueling windows, evacuation routes, the hour of a flight from distress to help. Exercises rehearsed coordination with allies whose domestic politics changed, but whose need for an umbrella persisted. The posture communicated presence without spectacle. It reassured shipping lanes and air corridors that commerce could remain boring. In the background, procurement pipelines drove technology forward. Navigation refined by distant satellites. Communications encrypted, compressed, and routable. Sensors small and patient. Civilian life absorbed the spillover with a yawn. Car navigation, weather apps, parcel tracking, emergency alerts. The dual-use character of innovation made militarization appear mundane and modernization appear prudent. Yet the mundanity hides strain, maintenance costs that never sleep, rotations that bend families, training that races against the clock of obsolescence. The constellation glows over the planet and poses a mechanical question without drama. How long can precision remain affordable? Money markets, repo windows, clearinghouses, and settlement rails formed the circulatory system of the century's latter half. Most citizens never saw them. Their quiet success was anonymity. Payment instructions leapt midnight time zones and landed with finality scheduled to the second. Retail investors traded from kitchen tables. Pension funds hedged long horizons with instruments that did not exist a generation earlier. The United States, as issuer of the reserve currency and owner of deep capital markets, stood at the center, not by decree, but by depth. Crises revealed this shape. Stress made participants rush toward the largest pools. That gravity became influence. When sanctions were levied, they bit because the world preferred the system that enforced them to chaos without it. Yet each use of financial pressure taught others to plan around it. Alternatives grew. Secondary payment systems, currency swaps, reserves diversified into commodities and rival units. None matched the liquidity of the dollar, but redundancy is a patient instructor. The evening screen of interbank rates fades to a final, practical thought. In a world of backups, what counts as the primary?
Climate arrived as a boundary condition. Fires lengthened their seasons, storms learned new routes, droughts mapped themselves onto politics. The American response split along layers. Federal research funded models and monitoring, states set targets and built transmission lines. Cities redesigned streets and floodplains. Firms promised net zero pathways backed by purchase agreements and incremental upgrades. Markets priced carbon when lawmakers could not, and engineers shaved loss from motors, glass, and insulation. The country's role as an energy producer coexisted with its role as a technology vendor for transition. Exported expertise arrived as hardware, turbines, inverters, grid software, and as process, auctions, interconnection queues, performance standards. Allies watched the blend of subsidies and standards and adjusted their own. The transition moved at two speeds: equipment fast, habits slow. Yet within the delay, leverage hid. Whoever wrote the measurement protocols would shape the market for decades. The day closes on a sober curiosity, free of sermon. Can an era defined by abundance learn the grace of limits without losing its confidence?
Immigration refreshed the country's demography and dialects. Families arrived with degrees and with hopes, with stories that folded into existing neighborhoods and revived main streets. The labor market absorbed skills at the high and low ends, and the middle reformed around care, logistics, and code. Remittances flowed outward. Entrepreneurship sprang inward. The United States exported opportunity as narrative and imported vitality as fact. This exchange was not smooth. Papers delayed, policies argued, court cases decided, but the long arc bent toward inclusion as an operating advantage. Research groups became multilingual. Culinary maps redrew themselves. Schoolyards turned into experiments in future pronunciation. The world's talent pipeline ran partly through American institutions because they were organized to evaluate merit at scale, however imperfectly. The benefit was compounding, the friction persistent. As debates grew loud, the infrastructure of visas and accreditation labored in the background. The frame widens to a city block where languages braid at a crosswalk and places a simple query in the air like steam from a food cart.
How does a nation standardize entry without standardizing people?
Rivals matured with confidence. Europe regulated with detail, setting privacy as a right that software had to respect. China scaled hardware and platforms finely tuned to domestic conditions, while exporting industrial capacity through lenders and contractors. India assembled digital public goods, identity, payments, data sharing protocols at population scale and price points the world studied. In this polyphonic field, the United States retained its role as compositor more than conductor. Its firms integrated tools from everywhere. Its courts adjudicated disputes watched by everyone. Its capital markets priced risk others used as reference. The result was not hegemony, but centrality. Centrality can be comfortable and dangerous. It invites complacency and scrutiny in equal measure. It also multiplies responsibility. Standards written in one suburb steer factories oceans away. The evening quiet settles over a tangle of undersea cables coming ashore beneath an ordinary parking lot, and leaves a question hummed more than spoken. What does stewardship mean when the artifact is the world's routine?
Politics continued to oscillate while the chassis rolled on. Elections framed choices as turning points. Agencies translated them into rules with comment periods and footnotes. Courts checked. States improvised. Markets adapted. The pattern was not elegant, but it was serviceable. The durability came from redundancy. 3 branches, 2 levels of government, many centers of initiative. This redundancy cushioned shocks and slowed overreach. It also frustrated those who wanted clarity. Yet, in a century where power learned to whisper, patience became a strategic asset. Rivals could sprint, the United States could lope and still arrive, because the route had been paved with habits earlier in the story. That is the heart of the narrative. Systems outlast moods. As the scene fades to a warehouse lit with quiet LEDs, where autonomous forklifts follow lines on the floor and pallets hum toward trucks bound for towns no mapmaker will ever visit, the hook remains patient and unresolved. If endurance is the form of victory, what shape will the next test take?
The lens turns to health, an arena where wealth and worry sit side by side. Hospitals glow like small cities full of machines that listen to blood and breath. Insurance contracts move money along careful paths, translating risk into codes and reimbursements. Pharmaceutical labs push molecules through trials that take years and spreadsheets that take patience. Public programs lift some burdens while leaving others to employers and families. Compared abroad, the system looks both advanced and expensive, a paradox that policy keeps trying to solve with pilots and waivers. Yet its scale makes it a magnet for talent and investment, and its successes, transplants, targeted therapies, rapid diagnostics, become exports in method and marketplace. During crises, it can surge. During calm, it can stall. The push and pull reflect a larger theme of the century. Complexity is capacity, and capacity is cost. Out of this quiet arithmetic rises a practical puzzle that threads through clinics and Congress alike. Can a society keep the frontier of care open without turning care itself into a frontier few can reach.
Rural and urban life continue their long conversation. Cities stack ambition into towers and transit lines. They convert warehouses into studios and offices into labs. They attract capital, ideas, and impatience. The countryside turns scale into steadiness. Fields, wind farms, small factories, logistics yards at highway interchanges. Broadband lines sew them together unevenly, stitching opportunity where terrain and budgets allow. Universities sit as bridges between worlds, drawing farm kids into robotics and sending urban graduates to county health departments and extension offices. Elections map the gradients of culture and need. Policy tries to cross them with incentives and grants. Both halves depend on the other. Cities eat what trucks deliver. Rural towns sell into markets that ports and airports sustain. The relationship holds, but not without strain over taxes, culture, and the tempo of change. The narration pauses over a two-lane road where combines and sedans share the morning, then asks the steady question beneath the hum of tires. How does a nation balance speed with roots? Artificial intelligence joins the toolkit as a general-purpose engine. Models learn from oceans of text and images. They summarize, predict, and propose. Factories tune maintenance schedules. Hospitals sift scans. Call centers triage. Coders offload routine. The United States brings to this frontier the same assets that shaped earlier ones: research universities, venture capital, compute infrastructure, and a market eager to experiment. It also brings the same tensions: privacy, bias, labor displacement, security, and the fear that tools might outrun norms. Allies coordinate on safety rules, rivals race on capability. Startups chase niches while giants build platforms. The flow of chips, power, and data becomes a strategic triangle. Regulation arrives cautiously, aiming to steer without freezing invention. The promise is productivity. The risk is dependence on systems few understand end to end. The camera rests on a server hall where fans murmur like distant surf and leaves a question that is both technical and civic. Who audits the invisible decisions that soon sit beneath everything else? Space changes from symbol to service. Satellites form blankets of coverage for navigation, weather, mapping, and broadband. Launch costs fall as reusability matures. Private companies sell rides and rent capacity. The United States coordinates civil, military, and commercial orbits with rules that try to keep the sky usable. Debris catalogs, frequency allocations, traffic advisories. Remote sensing becomes a shared memory of the planet. Forests counted, ships tracked, crops estimated, disasters mapped in hours rather than weeks. Partnerships stretch from NASA centers to startup lofts, from universities to allied agencies. The romance remains, but the ledger grows practical. Contracts, ground stations, downlink windows, spectrum auctions. Here too, standards become leverage and insurance becomes discipline. As more actors enter, the tragedy of crowded commons looms. The section closes not with awe, but with a planner's calm worry. Can orbits stay open when success fills them faster than prudence clears them?
The hemisphere to the south is an intimate laboratory of policy. Trade weaves North America into a single workshop of parts and specialties. Supply chains reroute through Mexico as firms hedge exposure elsewhere. Energy interconnectors tie grids. Water agreements creep forward with caution equal to need. In Central America, development programs chase the roots of migration, safety, jobs, governance, while remittances remain the most reliable aid. In South America, cycles of commodity booms and reforms continue, with sovereign debt restructurings that test creditors and citizens alike. The United States is present not as overseer, but as neighbor with long memory. Drug policy, human rights reports, disaster relief flights, agricultural research, student visas. Influence here is granular and repetitive, measured in inspectors trained, courts digitized, ports modernized. The gains are real and reversible. As the camera lingers on a border crossing where trucks idle and paperwork glows on screens, the quiet query emerges. Can proximity become partnership without turning difference into friction?
Africa's demography promises a century of youth. Cities grow with speed that tests maps. Mobile money leapfrogs legacy banks, and solar kits light villages where grids have not reached. American engagement appears in pieces, health programs that fight viruses and train clinicians, seed funds for fintech, satellites that map harvests, and exchanges that bring civil servants and entrepreneurs to study procurement and accounting. Competition is wider now, with Chinese, European, Gulf, and Indian investors building roads, ports, and data centers. The U.S. advantage, when it shows, is often institutional. Transparent tenders, durable contracts, local partners who feel heard. The weakness is attention, which drifts. Yet the long cycle of education, law, and standards keeps turning, and alumni networks quietly braid continents. The section ends at a university courtyard where graduates pose with families under jacaranda shade, leaving a simple, patient question. Will the habits of rule of law and open science take root fast enough to shape the boom?
Media multiplies. The evening newscast that once synchronized households gives way to streams tuned to taste. Trust shifts from institutions to personalities, then sometimes back when emergencies demand reliability over novelty. The United States exports both the platforms that host debate and the techniques to interrogate them. Fact-checking, investigative methods, open-source intelligence. Disinformation becomes a trade of its own, cheap to produce and costly to counter. Schools add media literacy, while advertisers chase attention across formats that age in months. The legal frame strains under questions about liability and moderation.
Through the noise, a pattern persists. When events turn grave, audiences still seek steady voices, and the system's depth, local stations, public broadcasters, national outlets, and academic experts, proves its worth. The segment ends with the glow of many screens in one apartment tower and folds into a gentle riddle. Can plural voices share a common record without a common channel? Technology firms mature into civic actors. Their decisions on privacy, security, and content shape the experience of citizenship as surely as municipal bylaws. They build data centers that need rivers of power and lakes of cooling. They negotiate with towns for land and with countries for tax. They publish transparency reports that read like new genres of public document. The United States faces the task of governing with companies that operate across borders yet answer to domestic law. Antitrust returns as a living doctrine. Procurement becomes a lever to encourage open standards. Export controls become both shield and signal. Shareholders ask about impact. Employees ask about ethics. Users ask about choice. The state, once teacher, becomes collaborator and counterparty. As the section closes, a question sits quietly at the edge of a campus green. Can democratic oversight scale to firms whose jurisdiction is the interface?
Cultural fatigue appears like a low tide after a long swell. The world knows the tropes. The templates feel familiar. The soundtrack loops. Yet renewal hides in repetition. Regional scenes reinterpret global forms. Immigrant artists splice traditions. Small presses and indie studios reuse the same distribution rails to send different voices farther than their budgets should allow. The American ecosystem, noisy and self-critical, remains porous enough to absorb critique and turn it into craft. Museums curate new canons. Festivals shift the center by awarding work from the margins. Classrooms teach children to code and to dance, to weld and to write. The nation's soft power has always depended on the promise that reinvention is possible. It survives when that promise is kept at home. The frame lingers on a rehearsal room where the next thing is being made out of old tools and new patience, and leaves a quiet challenge. Will openness continue to translate into surprise?
The narrative returns to stillness. The century did not belong to America because it drew borders, but because it built routines others used. Production became policy. Currency became language. Culture became infrastructure. The costs, imbalances, resentments, contradictions are part of the ledger and cannot be waved away. Yet the structure remains because it works often enough to be chosen again each morning. Contracts signed in dollars, code compiled against shared libraries, planes landing by standards agreed long ago, strangers understanding one another across a grammar of trade, science, and art. Influence endures, not as a shout, but as a setting. Power learned to whisper, and the world, busy and tired, found the whisper convenient. The camera fades on a quiet street where lights change, a truck passes, a phone vibrates, and someone somewhere wires a payment that clears in seconds because a century ago, engineers and clerks decided how it should. The closing thought is gentle and unresolved, as befits a living system. If tomorrow runs on these habits,
Who will write the next ones, and how softly will they speak?